Hello and welcome to Sounding Board, a community access television program of Seroptimus International of Novato. My name is Madeline Peters. I am a professor at Dominican University of California, and I am very happy to have as my guest today Dr. Melanie Hahn, who's been a professor at several universities in the Bay Area. And I'll have Dr. Hahn introduce herself in a moment, but first just a little bit about our organization. Seroptimus International is a global organization whose mission is promoting the status of women and girls, leading to global and economic empowerment. So again, Sounding Board is a program of our local club, Seroptimus International of Novato, and we're very fortunate to have people who coordinate these programs with us. And we've been able to produce programs of interest to the local, national, and international community. Dr. Hahn, thank you very much for being here. And I know in academic circles we call each other by our first names, and we certainly can do that as we have our little discussion. But it's a chance just to honor the fact that being a professor and going through that rigorous process of getting an advanced degree does deserve recognition and acknowledgement. And so
thank you.
I want to make sure that even though we've had a professional relationship and personal relationship, that I honor the effort that both of us put through to achieve that distinction. Anyway, Melanie, the show is yours.
All right, thank you. It's my great pleasure to be here today, and I was really touched by Madeline's invitation to come and talk about my life, and I was thinking, does she mean my academic life or does she mean my entire life? And then I realized my entire life is my academic life. It's all kind of like melded together. And I'm a third generation Korean American who came here, obviously did not come here, but was brought by my grandfather. He was the first generation. And he came during a very tumultuous time in Korea when the Japanese were trying to establish a colonial state in Korea. But he left earlier than that, and he was a very active student activist, and there was a death threat after him. And boats were coming to Korea, and they were going to the Americas, and everybody was fleeing the Japanese and saying, the boats are here, let's go to the boat. And my grandfather said, where's the boat going? And they said, we don't know. And he said, well, that's not good enough for me. I need to know where it's going. And they said, we can't tell. He says, I need the boat to go to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. I don't want to just go to Hawaii or go to, I don't know where you're going to the Americas. It's a big, huge place. There's Latin America, North America. It's just too big. I know exactly where I want to go. So a bunch of his friends got together, and there was a death threat after him, and there were pictures, drawings. In those days, they didn't have photographs. And pictures all over the place, and he was very desired and wanted, there was a death threat after him. So his friends put him into a small farm home. He wasn't able to go home and see his mother that night. And apparently every night for the rest of her life, she'd go up to the gate where she waited for him to come home from school and cried, and she died of a broken heart because he never came home. So what he did in this farmhouse was have his friends dress him up like a farmer, and he thought he was going to cross into the Japanese. Now this is a crazy thought. Who wants to do this? And he wanted to cross over from Korea into China, over the Yalu River, and to meet a couple of other intellectuals in Manchuria, which he was able to do. And at the border, he met his best kindergarten friend who was conscripted by the Japanese army. And he recognized my grandfather, and tears welled up in his eyes. He said, you're so patriotic. You care so much about our country. And look, I've turned my back against the country, and I've become a member of the Japanese military. And my grandfather looked at him and said, can I pass or can I not pass? Answer the question. Pass, please pass, and that's how my grandfather got through. Then he ran, literally, he was an Olympic runner and very physical and very athletic. He ran to Manchuria, grouped up with his intellectual friends, wrote the provisional government of Korea. And then the Japanese were coming, and they were coming from all ends. Although this was really much earlier than the rape of Nanking, which occurred in 37. My grandfather came before, Korea was occupied from 1910 until the end of World War II. So I want to say he was 19 years old, and he must have come here just before 1910. Things were very unstable in Korea. There were a lot of Japanese there. Things had, over the centuries before 1910, Japan had tried to enter Korea. So it wasn't like it was a brand new historical conflict. It had been ongoing. And he landed in Angel Island, and he thought he was so clever because he stowed away from Shanghai, where he was able to work at the French concession, because Americans would not hire Orientals, and Orientals are rugs, not people. And so, and so he learned how to cook, which is like something that men don't do in Korean families. And he got on this boat, and he was so proud of the fact that he got away with it, because he stowed away in a Chinese boat, and he ended up on Angel Island. And I said, Papa, they can't tell the difference between what we look like, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. The guys at the immigration center don't know the difference. And they were turning away Chinese in droves. And there were more people that came to this country through Angel Island than through Ellis Island, but they were not recorded because they're people of color, so they, quote unquote, don't matter in American history. So that's a little known fact. I don't know if many people know that, but it's true. So my grandfather had nobody to really sponsor him, so he was put in a barrack, and I live now in Belvedere, which is right kitty corner. I mean, I can see exactly the very barrack that he was in. And my grandfather made it through the church, who sponsored him to come into their community, and that was the Methodist Church on Powell Street. And my grandfather's sitting in church going, I really don't believe in God. I didn't come here to do this. I came here to organize Koreans against the Japanese. So he ran away from this church environment, but he was now already accepted to the mainland.
So he was a very smart man.
A very smart man.
It's interesting, just a moment there, Melanie, just in terms of the sort of richness of the story, certainly the intelligence of your grandfather and the drive and all of the things that he has had to navigate to get out of Korea and get into California. This is really quite an amazing story of his strength and endurance.
Because he knew exactly where he wanted to go. How he was going to get there was all about strategy, timing, what city to leave from. And so he was constantly in discourse with other Koreans who were trying to work with him and support him. I think in the Asian American history books, he's heralded as one of the two most prominent leaders of the anti-Japanese movement. And he was headed for Nebraska. Why? Well, they had the most aggressive military group of Koreans that were established in Nebraska. So that's where he was going to get military training to learn how to fight the Japanese. The leader of that group went back to Korea, was immediately assassinated. So that group disbanded. My father was born in Nebraska. Koreans in Nebraska? Is that possible? Well, yes. There's only one. It was my father who was born in Nebraska. It was crazy at the time. So my grandfather traveled up and down California, first working in various produce jobs, and felt very insulted because he's super educated and came from a very aristocratic class. And so he never spoke about his experiences in America. And I noticed that he chose not to speak English. And I said, well, it's all well and good for your patriotism and everything, but it makes it very difficult for the family because everybody has to run around and speak Korean and translate everything for you. And you can't get a job, and life is really difficult. He said, I don't care. I'm very sure about my position, and my conviction was to never learn the language of this country because they didn't treat me well. They didn't treat you well because it was during the anti-Chinese period, anti-Chinese sentiment. The foreign miners tax and all of the other laws that came forward. And what did they bring the Chinese over here for? They're working on the railroad and the gold, right? And so when that was depleted, they wanted to get rid of them. So at that time, my grandfather's coming at the turn of the century, crazy. Chinese are moving out, moving in, we're not sure. I mean, a lot of Chinese stories, we know that they had picture brides or they had married a woman in China, could never amass enough money to return. You could see them in Portsmouth Square in San Francisco. They're lonely and they're sad. My grandfather lucked out. He was a young man and came across a boarding house for Koreans. And the first daughter of the man who owned the boarding house was a beautiful woman. He fell madly in love with my grandmother, and they eloped. They eloped at this. I mean, she would come home, and he was so much older. He was like 20, 23 or something, and she was 14. And so my grandmother's father would beat her. And so this was so unacceptable to my grandfather, so he said, I'm just going to take you. I'm in love with you, and I'm just going to take you. And she had many siblings and separated from her family, and they had a very wonderful, happy marriage and ended up in Nebraska, had their first child. And my grandfather's like, I'm a family man now. I've got to settle down. I've got a kid. So they ended up in Chicago. And then they decided to start this restaurant because my grandfather had learned how to cook.
Cook, right? Yeah.
But who knows about Koreans? Nobody. So what they did is my aunts went to Macy's and found Chinese pajamas and then had the Han's restaurant and sold it as a Chinese restaurant. I mean, who else would know about this? They don't know who Koreans are. And it was quite successful. So this is like we're heading toward now the Great Depression, right? We're coming out of this period. Well, that's a long time.
Yes.
But in between that time, my grandfather, so dedicated to what to do about the Japanese, started the first Independence Air Force in Redding, California. And he taught everybody, he learned how to be an aviator, and he taught this whole cadre of Koreans how to fly an airplane. And I said, Papa, that's a Jenny 2 plane. Could you even get to Hawaii? How are you going to get to Japan and drop this? It's the spirit. It's the intention. It's the fact that I learned how to do this that makes me so famous. And I was like, famous? You're famous? He says, I am. And he is. He's quite famous. And his name is Han Chang-ho, and he worked with An Chang-ho. And they're often conflated in the history books because their names are so similar when you say it quickly. You know, they very good-looking men, so they're also similar, and it's hard to tell. But I can always tell when I look at the pictures. Han Chang-ho is always in a picture with my grandfather. And they traveled into Mexico, and they went all over the United States, and they organized many Koreans, and they started periodicals. They weren't as ambitious as my mother's mother, who started the first Korean American newspaper in Los Angeles and started the first Chinese Korean newspaper in China.
Your story is just so compelling, and I know you're an author of several articles, and you know, just your story of your father or your grandfather and your parents. You know, unless the information comes from you, the information doesn't exist for the American people about Koreans and the importance of your grandfather and your family members as real leaders, you know, and getting a better life for themselves and moving forward.
Well, my father helped. He decided when he was 10, he says, I'm of superior intelligence.
At the age of 10?
At the age of 10. I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up. And I'm like, Daddy, you need to tone it down. You're a doctor now. Maybe your ego's getting a little bit big. So he said, no, I entered a contest in Chicago to name the big theater. And of all the people in this large city, I won. And I pulled my entire family out of the worst depression during the worst time in American history, out of the Great Depression. And that was a boon for our Han family. And I mean, this 10-year-old kid did this for his entire family.
My goodness.
And his Uncle Paul contracted TB, and Dad said, okay, this confirms why I'm going to be a doctor. Uncle Paul didn't survive it. And the family was also split because they were so poor. My grandmother's youngest sister was given up for adoption, and they're not supposed to connect with the family in those days. But my Uncle Paul followed her. And when she was 18 years old, the magic age of 18, he found her on the front steps of the university where she was. She was raised with white parents. And he went up to her and he said, I'm your brother, and you've been separated from our family, and I want you to come back to the family. And I have no knowledge of her white family at all. She's just my great aunt, and she's been with us since I was a little girl. I've only known her as family.
Can you set this is an incredible story, in the context of your own life and, you know, the connection between the experiences your family members had and how this has impacted you?
Well, I mean, my grandfather was a patriot, and so he won the what is like the Congressional Medal in this country. There's only one of them for patriotism. We had to go back to Korea. But my grandmother, on my mother's side, joined the Communist Party. And that was kind of a conflict within the Korean American community. So my mother was the first girl out of 7 children. There were 5 boys, and then She was the sixth child, and she was very long and tall and was hounded by her brothers. And suddenly at the age of 17, just blossomed into this beautiful woman and was asked to be the first Miss Korea in America. And Dad at that time was of marriageable age. And my grandmother approached my grandfather and asked if maybe they might get the two together. And it was like, oh my goodness, maybe we don't want to hook up with communist Koreans. Maybe it was the brouhaha in the community. But when my father met my mother, that was the end of it. He was going to marry her, it didn't matter. It was the first original bachelor show in this country, I'm sure. He sat at the table with all these beautiful women. And my mother sat at one side, very quiet and very introverted. She's a writer, and writers usually are kind of introverted people, quiet, shy, thoughtful. And he's a very outgoing, type A, aggressive type of guy, so it was a perfect combination. But he took out the wrong woman. He took out this woman who talked to him. They got along at dinner. He took her out, and he couldn't shut her up, and he hated it. So then, after that, he said, I'm going to take the other woman. He had the most fantastic date with her. She said nothing. He talked all night long. Mm-hmm. So that made him very happy. And after that, he fell madly in love with her, and he was sure that he was going to marry her. And my grandfather she's Korean, and we were also affected by anti-miscegenation laws. We're not allowed to marry outside of our race. And so that would have been a perfect union had she not been from a communist family, which has also followed me. And I, in South Korea, have been accused of being a communist. So South Korea is, since the war was over, has had just a series of dictatorships, starting with Park Chung-hee and then on, until more recently we have a president who believes in spirits and shamans and I don't know, but now she's gone. So it was during that kind of post-World War II period where before the Japanese came to Korea, I think Korea could be said, or could be stated as maybe one of the most peaceful countries in the history of man. For thousands and thousands of years, there were no conflicts in Korea, but there were people who wanted Korea. So Korea cut itself off from the world and was known as the Hermit Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And as such, it was very peaceful because the rules were very clear. It's a highly Confucian country. Mm-hmm. Although there are more Buddhists in Korea than there are Christians in Korea. But people in America think of Mr. Moon or Reverend Moon and the movement of Christians in Korea is a big thing, but actually Christians are a very small population compared to Buddhists. So we're very traditional. And we're also very homogeneous. So I'm a living example. I'm not married. Here I am, I was supposed to pursue academia, but I wanted to tell my grandfather's story. And how could I get that out? And how could I do that as an academic? And how could I pull these ideas together as an Asian American? And I thought, let's just talk about the rape of Nanking. Let's just bring the Asian Holocaust together. I'm a professor here at the school. I'm doing diversity work. I'll create a conference. So I went to my mentor. He loved the idea. And I put on the first academic conference on the Asian Holocaust at Dominican. That was
that was in, what year was that?
That was like 90.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then you went on to do other things. I mean, I really see you, and you sort of made sure that I knew and kind of escorted me to those meetings and conferences and things like that.
Well, it was a great idea because at the time, Iris Chang was writing her book, and Ling Chi, my mentor, thought, this is a topic I haven't really embraced that we could unify the Asian American community behind. And it worked and it didn't work. And the way it didn't work was that the Japanese interpreted it as against the Japanese. And this is a point that I really want to make clear. We are not upset with Japanese civilians at all. The people of Japan have nothing to do with this issue. It's against the Japanese military machine. When you look at any of the YouTube videos about what happened during the rape of Nanking, which was a 3-day horrible, unbelievable, unspeakable series of events that occurred, it's only driven by the Japanese military machine. There aren't civilians out there killing Koreans. I mean, why would they? Everybody was poor during those days. I was even called in the planning meeting by the then Consulate General of the Japanese Consulate, who later became the Prime Minister, good-looking guy, educated at Yale, whisked me down the hall in a very fancy hotel, pushed me in an alcove and said, you've got to please stop your friends from doing this. We have tried to apologize. No, you need to apologize. no, you need to understand. You understand, don't you, what Korea was like during the 20s and 30s? I'm a third generation Korean American. I have no idea what it was like in Japan in Korea during the 20s and 30s. This is my grandfather's story. This is not my story. I mean, it is my story. I come from this, but I cannot relate to the things that you're talking about and the poverty and the desperation of the people because, you know, it was just a very difficult time in Asia at that particular time of history. And Japan also, well, we were first allies with the Nazis. And then that stopped, and the Nazis became allies with the Japanese. So Americans need to understand that we were allies with the Nazis. A scary thing that we don't talk about, but it is part of our history.
I think that's one of the things that was so intrigued me about all the different conversations I've had with you. You're always ready to put this information out. You wanted to tell the story, which is why I wanted you to tell your story here today. You were ready to put this out and articulate what happened so that the story was shared more publicly. There's so much information that is hidden or misinterpreted or disguised or stories that aren't told at all. And the ignorance just perpetuates itself.
It does. And I think what makes it worse is that the Japanese change their textbooks. They do not, the populace, the civilians, do not know the true history. And on Monday, this last Monday, Abe made an overture for the first time in the history of the relationship between Japan and Korea since the end of the war, offering over $8 million as reparations to stop this complaint and this request that they apologize for. But he did this for economic reasons because he knows that Korea is up and coming, and Japan wants to work with Koreans for the New World Order. So it really doesn't have much to do with the comfort women, but he used that as the topic.
Could you just explain a little bit about the comfort women? And then actually, I think Abe's comment was sometime in January. I was reading an article by
that was the prelude for his his 8 million gift.
But anyway, and just to, again, set this all in context and sort of, and also just touch on why it's important to have conversations like this, for you and I to have conversations like this and make them available.
Comfort women, I think we all know that whenever you have a group of military men, you've got to provide women for them. It doesn't matter where they are. I mean, who knows what Cheney is doing in the in Eastern Europe? We have no idea, you know, now. And I'm sure that in every war, there's some effort to provide women for the soldiers. And in the case of the Japanese, they created comfort homes, comfort houses for comfort women to provide comfort in the form of sex to the Japanese military. But this meant actually taking young girls from their homes, pretending that you're a scholarship company and your child, who is maybe 8, 12 years old, won a tremendous scholarship because of her academic performance in school. And could we take her to her new school? And the parents were very excited, and they would steal her and put her into sex slavery, where she would be raped 60, 70, 80 times a day at a very young age. So a lot of these women, and now if we're looking at what happened up, you know, around from 1937 on, that's missing what happened from 1910. Now the Japanese did the same thing in Okinawa. My girlfriend's Okinawa. Her mother had a first family. She only had boys. She had 5 boys, and she had a husband, and she had to witness her husband and her 5 boys shot in front of her, and then she was forced into sex slavery and saved by an American who was Filipino Chinese. And so my girlfriend is a product of that. She's the first child. So she's half Okinawan, 1/4 Chinese, 1/4 Filipino, quite beautiful, and became Japan's first Western model. But she doesn't want to talk about the fact that she's Okinawan. I said, it's quite cool to be Okinawan. It's like being Korean. It's really cool because you come from a history of colonization, and you need to, you know, up yourself and overcome this. But I do realize that colonization takes people down in horrible ways like slavery does. And so I see her mother driving her crazy because, of course, any woman who is subjected to that would go crazy. And so Yumi, as the oldest daughter, has to negotiate this relationship with a crazy mother who's interested in social activities and social work, which she hates. Yumi hates to do this, but her mother loves it because it connects her with all the people who changed her life and saved her. And Yumi has younger brothers, so she's actually the mother. And she doesn't talk about being Okinawan. She wants to say that she's Japanese. I said, you're Okinawan, and it's a cool thing. And her daughter is my godchild and read Mom's book, which is about, it was the first Korean
The title
American.
of your mother's book?
Is called Clay Walls.
Clay Walls.
And the author is Kim Ron-young, and that's her Korean name. And it's a story about her family, but it is a microcosm of the larger Korean American experience of the first wave, who all came from North Korea.
So now, just to kind of turn the corner a little bit on this story is, this is all your story, your family's story. And then I'd like to focus in on you, because I've always found you a remarkable person to be with, both in terms of a professional sense and a personal sense. It's like your ideas and your knowledge and your storytelling ability made me think and kind of move outside of myself as a white woman of white privilege and educated. I didn't have the experience that your family had, but you helped me kind of step outside myself. How do you see yourself at this point going forward? How is this impacting who you are and what you're doing right now? Certainly, you know, your experience of being an academic and bringing your story to the public view is important too. Can you talk more about who you are and
it's
what you're doing
actually
right
much
now?
earlier than before I became a professor. I mean, it revolved around the whole issue of identity formation. And when I met Ling Chi, he was in a public forum downtown from the mayor's office on a microphone talking about bilingual education, and I said, this man is articulate. I got to get to know him.
Can you just create a contest text for Ling Chi's so that our
Ling Chi is like a community leader in San Francisco. He's an insider and an outsider. He's an amazing man. He's the head of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. He started the first ethnic studies program in this country. It's probably the biggest and most successful of all institutes of higher learning across the nation.
And he was your mentor.
And he's my mentor because I saw him stand up and give the speech, and I thought, I've got to meet this man. So I did. I waited until everybody left, and I stood on the stage, and I said, sir, may I meet you? My name is Melanie Hahn, and I'd like to do anything I could possibly do to just be by you. And he looked at me and he said, okay, can you meet me at Berkeley? And he gave me his address. And he and Henry Durr, the three of us, started our own Asian American group in San Francisco. And from that, I started a Korean bilingual program. And I entered into the field of education with his urging and started in working with the bilingual program in San Francisco. And the director told me the first day I arrived, you, the Korean program, cannot apply for a grant. Everybody else can because they're already established, but I want the Korean program to be a traveling teacher because Koreans are established in different parts of the city. I got up from the meeting, I went over to the telephone, I called the U.S. Department of Education, I ordered the application, I got off the phone, I came back to the meeting, goes, did you just do what I told you not to do? Mm-hmm. He said, why did you do that? Because the U.S. Department of Education's job is to give public education seed money to start interesting projects. And I've got a vision, and if you're not going to let me do it, then I'll ask them to help me because you're just a boss, and I've got tenure.
Melanie, it's like, I know you probably, I need to give you probably another 90 minutes just to kind of transition into who you are and what you're doing, but we're just about at the end of our time for this show, and
I mean, that Korean program went, it started with nothing, and it is now the national model for bilingual education.
Well, this is who you are. This is Dr. Melanie Hahn. This is who you are. So one last thing, just briefly, before we wrap up the show, what's one important thing that you would want to say to convey to our audience?
I really think that there's such an important place for, and especially now, I thought that we would get through multicultural education and diversity issues and come out better at the other end. But actually, at this particular time in American history, we're looking at a president who is identifying people on the basis of their religion. And this is exactly what we don't want to have happen. People who are judged based upon the way they look, or the language they speak, or where they come from, what they believe in. And so it's like we've gone backwards in time. And we're now in very scary times where religion, the way you look, matters. Race matters. Cornel West is correct. And probably more so now than at any other time. Even when it was in its heyday and we were really powerfully into multicultural education, it's way before that. We're sent back in the days when Japanese could be interned. We could intern Muslims. It's not hard to say one day you're a citizen, the next day you're going to be asked to leave this country.
Well, Melanie, we are out of time right now. Just as I want to go into chapter 2 of our story, you create a context for your family's experience and you bring it up to the present day. And it's very, it's humbling to listen to you. It's important to hear your story and to think about the impact that we all have.
And the responsibility.
And the responsibility. And at least you speak up and bring people to consciousness about being responsible. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
This is Sounding Board, a program of Seroptimus International of Novato. My name is Madeline Peters. I'd like to thank Dr. Melanie Hahn for taking the time to be here. I'd also like to thank Novato Community Television for providing us with the studio time and the expertise. Again, thank you. This is Her Story, Dr. Melanie Hahn. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you.